Hello, and thanks for taking the time to listen to Reimagining Cyber. New episodes of the podcast drop every Wednesday. So to make sure you never miss a show, do hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen. You can also find us on the @Reimagining Cyber YouTube channel.
Hello and welcome to Reimagining Cyber. My name is Ben, and what you're going to get today is a continuation of a bunch of conversations we've been having over the past few months about identity, info stealers, and account takeovers. With me is cybersecurity expert Tyler Moffitt. Tyler, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it feels like all of those threads are starting to connect into one bigger story.
Absolutely. I mean, so if you've been listening to the podcast and you've heard me rant about a lot of those things that you mentioned, this is sort of the time or moment, I would say, that sort of it all comes together. And, it's what we're seeing right now essentially isn't, a new tactic. It's essentially the full attack chain essentially coming together really clean in a very scalable, easy to jump right in way for attackers, augmented and helped by AI that just makes it, how do you say, marketable for anybody to get involved and want to be a cyber criminal, if that makes sense.
So set the stage for us then. What are we going to be building on from previous episodes?
So, yeah, we've talked about, I think, previously in sort of identity being the new perimeter and a bunch of different threat reports and data I've talked about. We also talk about cybercrime as a service and how many of the items from info stealers, whether you're talking about the sessions and the cookies, our access is just basically being bought and sold, right? And the info stealers that I've covered on many different episodes is like sort of the backbone of the underground, cybercrime ecosystem. It's it's background noise, and it's what we're seeing now is that these are not just isolated separate topics. And basically, it's just like one continuous pipeline now. We've covered this before. So when I talk about the info stealers, it's that super finite, lightweight malware. It's scraping and looking for credentials, session tokens, browser data, and then it just ships it off to the marketplace. We're not really even talking about ransomware. Absolutely, don't get me wrong. Info stealers are the backbone and the first stage payloads that make way for ransomware, but we're starting to see not even the need for ransomware anymore, or destruction, or anything that would encrypt payloads, because then you talk about data exfiltration as the final stage. Data exfiltration is now, potentially making more success in payments than actual ransomware. So the data collection at scale is massive, if that makes sense.
And this is the quiet theft that we talked about before, really, isn't it?
Yeah, no, you have to realize that this isn't new. This trend of the data extortion and that being like the focus of collecting as much data as you possibly can, whether it's PII, really important customer data, or anything that would be super nasty if it were leaked, or if we're talking about literally just credentials and session tokens that can be sold in the marketplace, it's huge. This is feeding everything else, right? It's massive.
And it all ties back to the cybercrime marketplace conversation we've had as well, doesn't it?
Right, and things have basically accelerated there. That's why I really wanted to talk about this, is that marketplace is sort of going into overdrive, and we're seeing like a faster turnaround time from the data collection and the scraping of that, the credentials, the session token, the browser data, on sale to being sold, better indexing. I mean, easier access now to buy this stuff, like through Telegram and automated shots. Honestly, Telegram has sort of exploded now, and that's the preferred means of encrypted, secure communication to go and buy all this illegal stuff that was stolen, if that makes sense. Because so essentially, like of attackers doing any recon, they don't need to do any recon anymore. They just go to these places and these shops and just query databases.
Wow, that is nuts.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to. It's like literally they go and then they type in something like, give me corporate credentials with access to Microsoft 365, and then pull it up, whatever returns, you can just go and buy that. And that's it.
Okay, let's talk attack chain then. Talk us through how this actually plays out.
Right, yeah. That's definitely where everything sort of comes together, clicks into place. You've got sort of, I'll break it down into sort of like 5 different stages, if you will, of this pipeline. So the initial infection, right? Almost always user driven, right? Download phishing fake invoice, attachment, you name for it. User has failed, user has clicked, user either lands on a phishing webpage that collects the credentials themselves, or they download some script, some attachment, some executable, you name it, and then from there, next stage, right? Credential and session theft. So that's the info stealer piece we've already talked about. And then from there, whatever it collects, they can then immediately sell. And then that's the aggregation and sale. Those logs, those tokens, you name it, any browser data or anything they can possibly scrape that has a monetary value will essentially hit the marketplace very, very quickly. And then from right there, it's available to purchase, right? Different types of actors, depending on the type of cyber criminal that raises their hand, is like, I want to be part of the ecosystem, or ransomware as a service, or malware as a service. I mean, you have many different peoples, whether they're developer level of expertise or just an affiliate who's like, hey, I don't know how to do anything. I'm just raising my hand here. Give me all the payloads and everything you have, and show me how to run stuff, and I'll go ahead and do it for you. And, we'll split the payment and stuff like that. Different people will buy it, and it's, again, totally separate from the initial infection. And so, a compromise for a machine that had that initial infection was an entirely different group that scraped the credentials, sold them, and then somebody buys it and then comes in and does something like ransomware or does something like data exfiltration. Could be a completely different group that just bought it, right? And so that's because they were able to just log in and expand and then essentially move laterally. And that's the problem and thing we're talking about here is most of these, I've been breached, I've been hit with ransomware, all this customer information was stolen and attack, whatever headline that you've read, most of the time they weren't even really like hacked, if that makes sense. They literally logged in like a legitimate user. Okay. So no exploit, no brute force like we were talking about in graphics cards, being able to crack all these characters in certain many hours. That used to be how it was, but it's not anymore. There's like no noise around it. It's kind of crazy.
So when does the breach actually happen in that chain?
Well, yeah. So it used to be like an exploit, right? Or a, brute force. And that no longer happens, right? What used to also be malware execution and then breach. And then now it's just login. They literally logged in because they purchased the credentials. And then from there, they have fully authorized access as if they are the authorized user of the machine. And so then, it's everywhere now. Just that's how they take over the 365 account takeover, or the SaaS admin panel compromises, or internal phishing from real accounts. A lot of the times that first stage, takeover of like a generic employee is actually they're after somebody big, somebody in the executive or C-level suite. And it comes from an internal employee email because many people have, safeguards in place to where an external email coming in will be effectively much lower chance of success rate, right? But if it comes from an actual employee, then sort of a lot of the safeguards from that executive or C-level, it's much higher chance of success, and then actually getting and elevating your permissions or getting something in that they want from that, higher level executive. And that's really important change, if that makes sense, that I have to call out.
Which is way harder to detect, I guess.
Yeah, we talked about this. It's valid credentials, known user, sometimes even normal geography. If they know who they got it from, they can, change their VPN to make sure that they're even accessing the computer from the correct location that it should be, to not even arouse any suspicion if they were even sniffing for that.
But what about MFA then? Where does that stand now?
Yeah, it's still important, and you would think that this would help here, and you absolutely need it, but it just isn't the barrier or shield that people think it is anymore, because when you steal, and I talked about this, stealing session cookies or hijacking like OAuth tokens or essentially reusing those authenticated sessions, we talk about logging in, but in some of these cases with those tokens and re-authenticated sessions, they're not even sort of logging in. It's like a super login where they continue a session that's already trusted. And those of you who don't know, hijacking like OAuth session tokens or reusing authenticated sessions, those bypass and defeat even password resets. So even if you were to suspect something happened or you reset a password like continuously all the time, buying that token, if it's authenticated and has like, let's say, a super long delta of time to live, right? And you basically just reuse that authenticated session, it works through any password reset. which is kind of crazy.
And the system then thinks they're already verified.
Right, defeats all of it. It's a complete straight bypass, doesn't even require it. So definitely a big problem.
All right, then, these cyber criminals, these hackers they're in, what are they doing?
So obviously, for the longest time, 13 years or however long ransomware has been around, that's been the number one choice for monetizing, a breach or getting in, right? Is let's just drop a big, giant, scary payload and then wait for people to want to pay and, come and get their files back. And what we're seeing right now, and this has been the trend for the past few years or so, is we're not seeing a big, scary ransomware payload. Maybe a note at the end, but essentially what they're doing is their data exfiltration and the leak, the threatened to leak, the damage to brand, reputation, crisis comms, have to write out a note to your shareholders or your customers that you were breached. And then you got to notify GDPR and the data privacy regulators within a certain amount of time, or you face fines that are like just a flat percentage of your revenue. I mean, it's crazy. And nobody wants to deal with that. It's absolutely terrible. It's awful. And nobody wants to deal with it. It's easier to just go after the data instead of dropping a big, scary payload, because the psychological squeeze that you have on just the impact of the data being leaked is usually enough to get people to want to pay any ransom versus needing to actually lock it down, right? It's usually faster, it's quieter, and honestly, like less risky for the attacker. It's still highly effective. In fact, some of the information we have that we've pulled from our reports that we talk about actually show a higher rate of people who pay the ransom on just data exfiltration only and not having a big noisy, ransomware payload that actually encrypts the data.
Tyler, as far as I'm aware, our audience are, by and large, they're defenders. I don't think we've got any big-time hackers out there. If you are, please do get in touch. Be interested to know who you are. But if you are a defender, this sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, I could definitely see things changing right now. It just feels harder and harder as time goes on. The years go by and it feels like the attack surface grows and grows and the success rate, decreases, and things you have to worry about. And AI just throwing a whole nother, exponential increase on everything. It definitely feels like, pulling your hair out. And, almost every stage I talked about here can look legitimate, from an analysis perspective, playing defense, user downloading something from an email. It happens all the time, right? Credentials used, especially if they use the right location, happens all the time. Logging in. This is all normal behavior that isn't going to raise any red flags, whether you have anomaly detection or anything going on, the data access, it happens all the time. There's no real big, obvious attack moment anymore. And that's difficult, right? When it sort of all blurs and blends in and you don't really have any sort of moment that like, oh, this is clearly it when you're playing forensics time.
Okay, time for the bigger picture then, Tyler. What does this mean for the industry?
So I would say it means that, the model itself and how people treat, attackers and defense and sort of the foresight that they play on what they think attackers will do, as the model's kind of flipped, if that makes sense. We built security around keeping attackers out, detecting malware, worrying about exploits, right? But now the attacker is essentially just using your own access against you. So now the new focus has got to be like on identity monitoring, session awareness, right? Behavioral anomalies, access control hygiene. How long are these sessions that you sort of want to audit the individual employee and how much access they have, how long they have access for. These session tokens, when they use these tools and log in, really have to be audited and sort of an offboarding and making sure they're not over permissioned, and the length of permission, all that stuff is massive, because that essentially dictates the worth or the value of that token or whatever's being sold on the underground, dark web marketplace when they buy this stuff.
All right, Tyler. So if you're listening to this, what should you actually be taking away?
Right. So 3 things. Assume credentials are already compromised. And this is very similar, hopefully an easy shift from, assuming that you're already infected. It's not a question of if, but when, right? And next one, number 2, and I say this all the time, I'm going to keep saying it. Identity is the front line now, right? Not just endpoint, not just the network, identity, the employees, like that is the new perimeter for sure. And last one is no longer expect ransomware to be like the only end game anymore. Everyone wants to know about ransomware. It's the big sexy threat in the room, has all the headlines, but they don't need ransomware anymore. Just the data exfiltration alone, whether we're talking about selling the scraped session cookies and OAuth tokens, which are hugely valuable depending on what your delta time to live is on them in the marketplace, but also stealing any customer information or anything that would be hugely impactful if it ever got out on a leak site, dark web of your customers or employees, and the damage to, brand and reputation. All that stuff has to be considered. And it's not just a noisy ransomware payload anymore. It's that silent data exfiltration, which is usually often the real objective here.
Yeah, there's nothing to be cheerful about. It's all a little bit unsettling.
Yeah, no, for sure. And this isn't, some future trend. This is literally what's going on right now, and has been going on for the past few years, but things are taking off, if that makes sense. And the shift, I would say, is that, you're not just trying to stop break-ins anymore. You're trying to detect when someone is already inside, is, acting like they belong. Some of these large organizations have to assume that already a small percentage of everybody who's logged in and using everything correctly, somebody is compromised and essentially under control of a bad guy.
Tyler, as per usual, some really interesting and, let's face it, frightening insights there. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And Reimagining Cyber will be back next week. You know where you can find us. And also, why don't you rate and review the show whilst you're there? Thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.